members of the panel are Ottmar Edenhofer, Mercator Research Institute; Mari Pangestu, University of Indonesia; Lord Nicholas Stern, London School of Economics; Joseph Stiglitz, Columbia University. This panel is moderated by John Room, World Bank.
Thank you very much, Nick and Joe, for the outline of what is in the report. We're very privileged to have two other members of the Commission with us here this morning. Mari Pangestu, former Minister of Trade from Indonesia and Professor at Columbia University, and Ottmar Edenhofer, Chief Economist of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Change Impact Research here in Germany. Ms. Pangestu, let's start with you. You represent a dynamic emerging economy in Indonesia. What does this report mean for Indonesia and similar countries? And from your perspective as a minister, how do you see the challenges and opportunities of the political economy of introducing these sorts of recommendations?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts. And I also like to appreciate all the organizers and the members of the Commission and our two esteemed leaders here. I think it has been a very huge learning experience for me, which I hope I can bring back to implement in Indonesia. I think the main message of this report is obviously carbon price is important. It has to be set at high enough level so that there can be behavior change. But I think third, all of you have mentioned the importance of complementary and facilitating policies. And I think for developing countries, this is actually essential and important. And I think for a developing country like Indonesia, I think what is important is not just the carbon price as an instrument for addressing the Paris Agreement targets, but it has to be woven in the larger, broader growth and development story. We can't really just have carbon pricing to be implemented to achieve what we want to achieve. You need the complementary and the facilitating policies, such as removing fuel subsidy, which was already mentioned, and policies that will support investment in sustainable infrastructure. So I think that's kind of the general point. Now, what does that really mean for developing country? Let me try to share my perspective from a developing country and Indonesian perspective. I think for developing countries to come on board, we have to make the case very strong that climate change and development are consistent, are compatible. And if you like, you can say there is this great bargain out there for development and climate change. They are not one or the other or sequential. And this is the only way I think developing countries can come on board. It's basically for development and growth, we need investments in infrastructure, for growth, for connectivity, for poverty alleviation, and so on. And for climate change, we also need investment in sustainable infrastructure, in technology. And there's this great opportunity with technology out there that we can actually leapfrog. So for developing countries which are at the beginning of investing in infrastructure, there's this great opportunity to just leapfrog and use the available technology and sustainable infrastructure out there. But that's kind of a long-term thing, and how do you convince policymakers that this is important? Otherwise, you just get into the short-run decisions because of political imperative and budgetary considerations. I'll give you a concrete example. In Indonesia, recently, the president decided that we need to have electricity in the border areas because it's a poverty alleviation thing. And what happened was, okay, we got to roll it out in 1 year. So what happened? They used fuel subsidy, diesel generators, because it was very fast and expedient, right? Because we don't have that plan, grand plan out there to invest in sustainable infrastructure. So we are talking about very large investment needs for sustainable infrastructure to support growth and access basic services, which is part of the SDGs. And I would say two areas stand out as very important for developing countries. Energy and urbanization, because all our countries are urbanizing at rapid rates. China, India, Indonesia, you're talking about hundreds of millions of people. So addressing urbanization is going to be really important. Smart, better cities, transportation, public transportation, and so on. And I think the political and social acceptance of urbanization is actually high because you are making people's lives better. So I think for political reasons, it's going to be an easier case to push. You can see how the level of pollution in Chinese cities was a very important catalyst, if you like, for the imperative to act, including the climate change imperative. And the new investments, I think, will push you to a more sustainable growth path. So how do you get there? Carbon pricing is a way to go, an efficient way to spark this shift. But I think the question for developing countries, I think everybody's saying you got to start now. But you can't really start now for many developing countries. We don't have the administrative mechanism and we don't have the capacity. Second, we don't necessarily have all the complementary and facilitating policies there. You have to start with removing fuel subsidies and putting the right policy in place, including how are you going to deal with the higher cost of energy as a result. So the social safety nets are very important. So I think while there's a strong theoretical case for high and credible price, as the report suggests, a lot of work needs to be done to convince policymakers and politicians and the public at large. And we need help from international community to support the two bottlenecks that face developing countries to go on this path. Financing and technology. And here we need partnership from all the multilateral institutions, including the new one called AIIB, and also the very creative, very innovative public-private partnerships to achieve this. And we may still have to make the case to governments and politicians about the grand bargain out there, climate change and development.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. Ottmar Edenhofer, maybe we could move over to you. As we know, significant amounts of uncertainty out there in terms of impacts and timing of impacts of climate change and on technology, and a number of different models and predictions that are out there. How did the Commission go about thinking about uncertainty in this context in terms of making recommendations?
Thank you very much. First of all, the most important thing was that we relied on multiple lines of evidence. As Nick mentioned, ranging from technological roadmaps to global models and also to national plans. And I think this is very important that we relied on multiple lines of evidence. There's a lot of uncertainty around these estimations, but let me highlight one specific uncertainty, and this is the uncertainty about the future fossil fuel prices, in particular the price of coal. So there is a likelihood, a reasonable likelihood, that the price for coal remains very low. Except for the US, in many parts of the world, the coal price might be below the gas price. So there's a huge risk that this expansion of coal will continue. Admittedly, in some countries, like in China and India, they had revised the coal plans. Other countries like Egypt, Turkey have expanded the coal plans. And basically, when we calculate the emissions coming from the existing coal-fired plants and the planned one, it's basically, they add up that we will exhaust already half of the carbon budget, which is consistent with the 2-degree target. So this is a very, very fundamental thing. And therefore, carbon pricing is essential. It's a kind of a hedging strategy against a low coal price, removing the fossil fuel subsidies. So this goes without saying. A carbon price delivers three nice things. First, it incentivizes carbon-free technologies and carbon-free infrastructure. That's important. The second thing is it penalizes at the same time the fossil fuels according to the carbon content. And the third aspect is it creates revenues. And the nice thing in the report is that these revenues can be used for reducing distorting taxes, but in this context of the G20, it is absolutely essential to highlight it creates revenues for infrastructure investments in energy, water, transport. And in this report, we say very clearly that in many countries with these revenues, which we propose as a roughly by 2020, even alone $40 per ton CO2, we can provide universal access to clean water, to clean electricity in 70 countries. And this infrastructure investments does not only reduce poverty, it also increases the competitiveness of these countries. And this makes carbon taxes or carbon prices as such a valuable source for financing infrastructure. And let me emphasize the last point. So we are talking about carbon pricing, which should be implemented by governments, and rightly so. And I hope that the finance ministers around the T20 will hear our message. But at the same time, multilateral development banks could also use this carbon pricing as shadow prices to evaluate the infrastructure investments, which are essential for the next 2 decades. So by and large, I would like to emphasize carbon pricing is essential. It can be complemented, but we should emphasize other policies can complement carbon prices. Nevertheless, without carbon prices, these complements will not lead to an emission reduction, which we might see which are necessary for achieving the 2-degree goal.
Very good. Thank you very much, Ottmar. I think we heard quite a bit from Joe Stiglitz and Nick Stern earlier. Maybe if I could give them each a minute each. Joe, maybe if you could talk a little bit about the role of carbon pricing in terms of learning and changing behaviors and what we've brought from behavioral economics before I go to Nick to talk about whether you're optimistic of seeing a $50 price by 2030.
Sure. So remember the question that the Commission took as its mandate, what price would elicit the kinds of behavior that we would like? And we weren't based on just theoretical models that said how people ought to behave. We were very focused on how people actually do behave. And that's what behavioral economics points out, that quite often the models that have been used in terms of rational expectations, rational behavior, did not provide a good description. So we were focusing on, as I say, how could we change behavior? One lesson that comes from behavioral economics is that it is large changes that often induce people to rethink how they behave. And that's why I think many of us were convinced that a significant, the sort of incremental prices, increasing them a little bit at a time, the analogy is like boiling a frog, and the frog never leaps out of the pot. And the idea is that a sudden change in the price, while actually being the correct shadow price, the correct social price of carbon, at the same time will induce people to undertake strong reactions, will induce firms to do the kind of innovation that they have demonstrated they can do, that will really enable us to get to the 2-degree goal.
Excellent. Thank you. Nick? $50 by 2030?
I hope so. Actually, between $50 and $100 by 2030. But if you think of how far we've come, excuse me for referring to the 10 years since the Stern Review, but when we published that, I don't think we would have guessed, and we didn't guess, that a panel would come down in price by a factor of 10. We didn't guess that most of the big car companies of the world would be making hybrid or electric vehicles. We didn't guess that the self-driving car would be upon us. If you look back at the way in which China and India have changed over this period, it is quite remarkable. So understanding has really deepened. Understanding that this is the growth story of the future for all the reasons we've described in terms of infrastructure investment now, demand side boost, supply side efficiency, and this whole discovery, innovation, Schumpeterian story. So our understanding has advanced enormously. Technology has advanced enormously, including, of course, we must emphasize materials. So we've come a very long way. That's the optimistic side because we can see all those forces continuing. On the other hand, if you look at the Paris commitments for 2030, they are not consistent with well below 2 degrees. So we really have to accelerate. I'm enormously optimistic about what we can do, and as we do it, it'll be a much better way of living. Cities where we can move and breathe, ecosystems that will survive, energy access to poor people around the world. It's a tremendous prize. It's a very attractive growth and development story. It's a story of the Sustainable Development Goals. So the challenge is not so much whether we can do it, because we can, and it's a much better way of doing things. But to come back to what the other people, Joe and Murray particularly, and Ottmar have emphasized, this is now a question of political decision-making of a strong and clear kind at the pace that we need it. We hope that this report will help generate exactly that.
Thank you. I'd like to close the panel. One word from the World Bank Group's perspective. For us, in addition to this being the growth story, on the flip side, it's very clear that we will not be able to eliminate extreme poverty unless we can address climate change simultaneously. And we see carbon pricing as a key driver of the innovation and investment that will be necessary in order to move this forward. To pick up on Ottmar's point, as of July 1, we will be shadow pricing carbon for all of our investments along the lines of the recommendation from this report. So thank you all very much. Thank you.